Our Bibles to the book of Ephesians, chapter 1. Once you find Ephesians 1, we're in verse 15. Once you find that, please stand. Yep, only one verse. Don't let that fool you. It's probably going to be a decent sermon anyway. The title of the message is How Loud is Your Faith? How loud is your faith? Once you find Ephesians chapter 1 verse 15, if you could stand. That way I know that you found it and we don't take off without anybody. No, it's all right. I understand. Understand your situation. You can stay seated. I was speaking more for, those that can. Yeah. Everybody but you and me, I'm already standing. All right. Ephesians 1:15 says, "Wherefore I also, after I heard of your faith in the Master Yahushua and love unto all the saints," and I hate to just end it there, so we're going to keep reading just a little bit. It says, "Wherefore I also, after I heard of your faith in Master Yahushua and love unto all the saints, cease not to give thanks for you, making mention of you in my prayers." Yeah, that's pretty nice. He's saying, wherefore, which means that he's pointing back at something, but we'll talk about that here in a second. Let's open up in a word of prayer. Most gracious Heavenly Father, we come to you yet again this afternoon knowing that you never get tired of our prayers, that you never get tired of hearing from us. I pray that you would open my mouth and fill it with the words that you would have me to say. I pray that you would open each and every one of our hearts and help us to receive a message today, regardless of what I say. I pray that you speak to us and that you transform us and change us into the image of your Son. All this I ask in the name of Yahushua Messiah, amen. And you may be seated. So verse 15, it's kind of just a thought. It's just barely a thought, but there's something profound in verse 15 that I really liked. When I read it, I wasn't even going to preach on this today. When I studied earlier this week, I was going to preach from verse 15 down to like 21, and I was going to talk about a lot of other things. And as I was preparing my message today, the Father gave me a different sermon, and I think it's profound enough that we don't want to just skip over it. So I want to talk about this. Wherefore, he says, wherefore I also, and whenever you find the word wherefore or therefore in the Bible, you ought to stop for a second if you haven't looked at it in context and figure out why it's there. Because wherefore, therefore, wherefore means because of this, or and so he said something previous to wherefore that wherefore is pointing to. And what it's pointing to here is that our primary duty as believers is to glorify the Father. And if you remember, if we go back just a little bit, like to verse 12, he says that we should be to the praise of his glory who first trusted in Messiah. And then he goes on to say, as those that first came to his glory, the ones that first trusted in him, are to glorify him. We are also, those that in Ephesus, those believers that came after the fact, are also meant to glorify the Messiah. Or glorify the Father. That is exactly why he saved us. He saved us for the purpose of glory. And there's a lot of things in our lives that we are going to be asked to do, that we're going to be called to do. Like right now, I'm called to be a pastor, and I'm standing here, and I pastor. And if I pastor outside of that primary goal of to glorify the Father, then I failed. I'm not going to do a very good job. If I witness to people outside of that primary goal, which is to glorify the Father, then I failed. A lot of ministries are failures because it's outside of that primary goal, which is glorify our Creator, the one who created us, the one who saved us, the one who developed the plan for your salvation, the one who broke up the road that was your life in order for you to get to a place where you called upon him and said, "Save me, forgive me, heal me." And so, knowing that our primary goal is to glorify the Father, knowing that, he says this, Wherefore I also have, after I heard of your faith in Master Yahushua and love unto all the saints, that he ceases not in praying for them. And we're going to talk about the ceases not in praying for them and all of the other stuff that's listed after the wherefore. But I want to touch on something that's really profound here. Let's just forget about the wherefore and the I also. And he says, after I heard of your faith in the Master. That blows my mind. Can you hear my faith? If I'm doing it right, you should be able to. He says, after I've heard of your faith in the Master Yahushua and love unto all the saints. And it made me ask the question, how loud is your faith? And I didn't ask this of anybody else because I was in the room by myself. I had to ask myself, Tim, how loud is your faith? Because Paul heard of the faith of the believers in Ephesus. He heard of them. He heard of them, and that's why he decided to write them a message. He heard of their faith, and so he felt obligated, compelled to reach out to them with the profound doctrine that's just found in the first chapter, but with the idea that there's no separation between the Greek and the Jew, with the idea that they're not to live in the manner of the Gentiles, but live after the manner of the instructions of the Father. He felt compelled to reach out to them because he heard of their faith. And because he heard of their love unto all the saints. See, faith is so misunderstood. Today, we're told that faith is something that happens inside of you. There's like this deep, dark thing, or not necessarily dark, but deep thing that happens in the darkest recesses of your heart that nobody can see your faith. And oftentimes I get told that, well, you can't see my faith. You can't see, my faith in God. You don't know how strong my faith is. And yet, Paul could hear of the faith of the people in Ephesus, couldn't he? And he knew that they had strong faith. And I think that in order to understand faith, we have to understand what it really means. And it comes from the Greek word, the word that we translated to faith in English. It comes from the Greek word pistis, which means moral conviction. And moral conviction, that puts a little bit more meaning to it, because moral means what's right. I mean, we know what morality is. Morality is to do what's right, to do what is correct. There's a lot of different opinions on what's right and what's correct. You can take ethics classes in college and learn all kinds of opinions on what is ethical and what's not ethical, what's moral and what's immoral. But moral conviction is what that word really means. And moral being what's right, conviction meaning that you're guided by what's right. What you know is right. So if you believe, for example, that the Bible is right, that belief in and of itself is not faith until it convicts you to change your life, until it drives you to become a better and a different person. So moral conviction is what faith really should probably mean. But a lot of people translate the word faith to mean I just believe something. I've talked to people that they've said, I'm very spiritual. I'm very spiritual. I say, you believe in God? Oh, yeah, I believe in God. You believe in Jesus? Oh, yeah, I believe in Jesus. You believe in the Bible? Oh, I believe the Bible's a spiritual book. And then you watch how they live their life, what convictions they follow, and it has nothing to do with what they say they believe. Believing something is true is the catalyst of saving faith. In order to have saving faith, one must believe that the Father sent His Son to die on the cross and shed His blood to cover sin. One must believe that. And it's so believing that is the catalyst. But if that's all you believed, then you've fallen short. James 2:19, if you want to turn there. James 2:19 is James chapter 2 is a chapter about faith. James 2:19 deals with a specific type of faith. It says this. I'm in 2:17, 2:18. There it is. Thou believest that there is one Elohim, thou doest well. Believing is the first step. If you believe that there is one Elohim, one God, then you're doing good. You've taken the good first step. But listen, he says, the devils also believe and tremble. Are the devils saved? No. Do the devils demonstrate faith in that one Elohim. No. They just believe. And if you just believe that something is true, but it does not alter your behavior and your outlook and your perception on life, if it does not alter you in some way, then that belief is not faith. But it's required. It's the catalyst for saving faith. Faith, true faith, saving faith, moves one to act. Noah believed God that there was going to be a flood. Would he have been saved if he had not acted on that belief and built an ark? No. No, he would not have. He would not have been saved. David believed that he believed God, and he believed that Philistine over there, that giant, should keep his mouth shut and shouldn't be blaspheming his God. Would it have elevated him to a position where he would have been king if that faith would not have caused him to act and face that Goliath, face that giant? No, he would not. Faith, that's why James said in chapter 2, we're not going to read James chapter 2, but James chapter 2 says that faith without works is dead. That you can believe something to be true. I can believe that my kids need to know how to do math in order to succeed in life. And I could believe that with all my heart. But if I don't teach them math, then it didn't move me, it didn't change me, and it didn't benefit me or my kids at all, did it? You can believe something to be true and it not benefit you at all. Faith, true faith, saving faith, moves one to act. And this is why Paul says, after I heard of your faith in the Master Yahushua. He didn't hear, somebody didn't walk up to him and say, hey, those Ephesians, they got a lot of faith. That's it, that's all I got to say. See you later, Paul. And he's like, oh, I better write them a letter. I've heard that they have a lot of faith. No, the Ephesians were doing things that was very uncommon. They were Gentiles. There wasn't Jews in the church at Ephesus. They were Gentiles. They were completely converted to obedience to the Father, totally in opposition to the ways that they were raised and their culture and their religion. They had abandoned things and started doing weird stuff. Like keeping the Sabbath and eating clean. They started doing weird stuff, like following some Jew who died on a cross. They started doing really weird things. And it got back to Paul. He heard of their faith in Messiah. How can you know what somebody believes? I mean, can you? Did you know that before World War II, before Hitler rose to power, before he annexed Austria into Germany, before that happened, there was a census taken about 5 years before all that happened. And of the census, 67% of Germans were Protestant believers. 33% were Catholic believers, and less than 1% were unaffiliated with either one of those two. Like, they might have been atheists or witches or who knows, mystics, I don't know. There was like a less than 1% were, if you add up 67 and 33, you come up with 100%. So there was a very, very small percentage that were not either Catholic or Protestant. And yet, they voted. And when they voted in Hitler as their leader. Think about that. Can you really know? I mean, we think of a Nazi as somebody that's totally not a believer, right? You judge that based on their actions. They killed a bunch of Jews. They were really mean to people. They talked funny. No, that talking funny, I just made that up. But the deal is that we don't think of like, oh, Hitler, he was a Christian. Or, oh, you know what? Well, Himmler was an atheist, so we can't say him. But you don't think of the guy running the concentration camps or going out there fighting with other Europeans about taking their land, you know, the ones that took France. You don't think, oh, they could have been believers. Because you judge somebody's faith based on their actions. Now, I'm not saying whether they were truly believers or whether they weren't. I'm just pointing out that when you think about it, you can't really tell what anybody believes unless it pours out of them. Unless it just overwhelmingly pours out of them. belief, faith, if it's saving, it's visible. It's a visible faith. You know, this world is watching us as believers. They're watching us. And we're supposed to be showing them faith, because if we show them our faith, then we're meeting that first criteria, which is to glorify the Father. I'm going to tell you, there's nothing more glorifying of the Father than to take somebody that's broken and wretched and change them into somebody that's useful and respected. There's nothing more glorifying. There's nothing more glorifying than when the Father takes Jacob and he turns him into Israel. Nothing glorifies him more than to take a deceitful liar who would steal his brother's birthright, who would deceive his own father into giving him an inheritance and a blessing. There's nothing more glorifying to the Father than for him to take somebody like that and make a nation out of them that he'll give his law to and give obedience to and bless them with the Messiah. A lot of people say, well, how can I make my faith visible? How can I show that I have faith? How do you treat your family? How do you treat the people? I'm not talking about just the people sitting next to you, although that's obviously a given. Your husband, your wife, your brothers, your sisters. How do you treat them? This world watches you, and if you want to show people that you have faith, then love people even though that they're sometimes unlovable. You know your family better than you know anybody. I mean, my kids, they know me better than any of you will know me. My wife knows me better than they do. And they love me anyway. That glorifies the Father. How do you treat your family? The people that we hurt often hurt the most, neglect the most. The people that we discard the most, that we disregard the most, are our families. You know, there's a stranger in the store might walk up to me and ask me for $5, and I'd give him $5. But my brother walk up to me, or my mom or dad walk up to me, or a cousin walk up to me that I'm close with, that I know that I could tell them no, and there's nothing they're still going to be my family. Will I give them the $5? Or will they suffer a little bit? How do we treat our family? How do we treat our enemies? Of course, the Messiah says, love your enemies. People get that confused a lot. They think that means love everybody. And I'm not saying that loving people is wrong, but I am saying that there are some people, if you love them, they will destroy you. They will kill you. But you are supposed to love your enemies. Sometimes that might be your spouse. Right? But it doesn't matter. It could be that guy at work. It could be the guy at the planning and zoning committee at the city you live in. It could be anybody. It could be somebody trying to sue you to take the property away from the church. Love your enemies. Love your enemies. How do you talk? This is a big one, because today, somehow, at some point in the last 10, maybe 15 years, believers have gotten it in their head that they can talk like the world. They can say all the same cuss words, that they can tell all the same dirty jokes, that they can use the world, they can borrow the world's language and say, hey, this is totally okay because I didn't take the Lord's name in vain. And they disregard all of the scriptures that say that we need to not speak with naughty speech, that our words ought to be pure, and that every word that we utter, we're going to be held accountable for. They forget all of that. They somehow in the last 10, 15 years, I grew up and I believed that you weren't allowed to talk that way, but sometime, and I honestly believe it has to do with modern television, because now they say words on television they could barely get away with saying on cable television before. You hear words on the evening news sometimes that you didn't hear except on HBO when you was a kid. How do you talk? Do you sound just like the rest of the world? Are you demonstrating your faith in the words that come out of your mouth? Are you demonstrating your faith in what you talk about? This world is going to talk about your favorite football team, politics. This world is going to talk about all kinds of fun stuff. What do you talk about? What do you talk about? People come up and ask me, they say, who do you think's going to win the Super Bowl? I say, I don't know, I don't watch hockey. She watches hockey. I'm picking on her. But the deal is that there's nothing wrong with watching hockey. There's nothing wrong with watching football. But if that's what you're talking about with people, and you are not talking about this, then are you demonstrating your faith? You are, but what are you demonstrating your faith in? That's scary. If you're more upset about who got drafted and who didn't get drafted into a football team or a baseball team or whatever teams draft people, than you are about the way that your kids today dress, or the way that people today treat each other. If you're more concerned about who got first round pick, or who's winning the March Madness basketball game or whatever, than you are about how much money your church needs and how much money ministries need in order to just succeed, in order to just break even, then you need to start thinking about how you demonstrate your faith. How do you demonstrate your faith? How do you dress? I'm constantly talking to my kids. My kids, they don't dress bad. They don't dress exactly the way that I would have them dress. But one thing that I know for sure is that if my kids go somewhere and they go buy clothes, one thing that's always going through their head, they don't always listen to it, but one thing that's always going through their head is, will my dad approve of this? Isn't that right, Hannah? Don't you think about that? Will my dad allow me to wear this? Sometimes is what they think, but they certainly are thoughtful. But how much more thoughtful should we be about what our Heavenly Father thinks about it? He's calling us to be modest in our dress. How do you handle adversity? When things don't go your way? When things break down at work? When things break down in your home? When communication breaks down between husbands and wives or brothers and sisters? When things break down, how do you handle that? Does that affect you? Does it affect your behavior? Do you become a different person because things are going bad on your bad days? Are you a different person than on your good days? That doesn't demonstrate your faith in Him. That demonstrates your faith in today, in circumstances. Our faith in Him, He doesn't change. Regardless of what kind of day you're having, it should be a good day. How do you handle adversity? He says, after I heard of your faith in the Master Yahushua. He didn't hear bad things, he heard good things. And the questions that I'm asking you are the questions that they could answer. Because they came out of a lifestyle where they didn't have a Christian culture. They didn't have a moral culture that backed them up and said, hey, you know what? This is the way you ought to dress. This is the way you ought to talk. This is the way you ought to respond to adversity. This is the way you ought to treat people, especially your family. This is the way you ought to treat your enemies. They didn't have that. They didn't have Sunday school growing up and one day they got saved. We're talking about people that were sacrificing, maybe even sacrificing children to false gods. Think about that. And their faith was heard of by Paul. And it inspired him so much that he stopped what he was doing and he wrote this letter, encouraging them and educating them on how to move forward in that faith. Oh, we should have such faith as the church at Ephesus had. And then he says that he didn't just hear of their faith, he says, and of their love unto the saints. That word saints is just a fancy way of saying those that are sanctified, those that believe. The word saint just literally means sanctified, set apart. People that are set apart. You don't have to die to be a saint. Guess what? You're a saint today if you're a believer because you've been set apart by that saving faith. And how you treat other people that have been set apart by that saving faith, well, that tells a whole lot about what you believe. You know, I've been divorced. Everybody here knows that. I've been divorced twice, actually. And I figured out, and this is not an easy thing to figure out. You always learn it the hard way because nobody in churches will tell you this. I figured out that how you treat your ex-wife or your ex-husband, that says more about your faith than how you treat anybody else. That says more about your testimony of salvation. How you treat the person that is you have to argue with about child custody, the person that's trying to take money out of your paycheck or that you're taking money out of theirs. How you treat that person. How you talk about that person to that person's children. How you talk about that person to other people. Says more about your faith in the Messiah and your faith in the Father than anything else. Because it's so easy. There's nobody in your life. There's nobody, trust me, there's nobody in your life that is going to sit there and listen to you badmouth your ex-wife that's going to say, whoa, hold on there, buddy. You can't talk about her that way. She's a nice, honorable person. Nobody. Everybody that you talk to will allow you to say whatever you want to say. And they'll just sit there and nod. It's so hard to be a believer when everybody agrees with you when you're wrong. It's so hard to demonstrate your faith. But let me tell you something. If you're married, you're not divorced like I am, then you ought to fall on your knees and thank the Father. But how you talk about your husband, how you talk about your wife, how you talk about your brother, how you talk about your sister, how you treat people when nobody else shuts you up says more about your faith than anything else. One of these days, there's a whole lot of people that sat in a church after they got divorced, had a whole bunch of people just love on them and tell them how much they loved them and told them how right they were for the way that they were talking about somebody else. If I talked about anybody else other than my ex-wife, the way that some people talk about their ex-wives, oh, they'd shut me up. But you can talk about your ex all day long, even in church. And one of these days, those kids of those broken homes are going to stand before the Father and testify against their parents. That's going to be a hard day for a lot of people who said, oh, I had faith. I had faith. Listen, faith should change you. It should change how you treat people, but especially those that profess salvation. I've seen married couples where both people professed salvation. Both people said, I'm saved, and one of them really messed up. And they got divorced. And the other one couldn't go to church there, and oftentimes didn't go to church anywhere else after that because of the way they were treated by believers. But the Messiah said this, John 13:35, the Gospel of John. (13:35) says this, by this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if you have love one for another. It doesn't say love one for another except under these circumstances where you got divorced. It doesn't say love one for another except if your family said bad things about you. It doesn't say love one for another except if you decide that they're no longer saved because of the way they treated you, which is what happens. Listen, we need to demonstrate love one for another. There's a lot of people out there that aren't keeping the Sabbath because they don't know about it, and you're never going to win them by talking down to them. You're only going to win them by showing love. You're only going to win them by saying, hey, listen, I know that you're doing the best you can. Let me help you do better. The most visible or audible aspect of our faith is how we treat other believers. I'm so grateful for this congregation because there is so much love in this building for each other. That's awesome that people come here and they're like, man, I felt so welcome. I mean, that was one of the things that Alan told me. I felt like, man, it was like coming home. And that's how it should feel when you walk through the doors of a congregation. It should feel like you're coming home if you're a believer. And that's great. But how you treat people outside this church that are believers, that say, hey, I'm under the blood of Christ too. That's going to be your most visible and audible aspect of your faith. The worldly person understands imperfection. A worldly person will understand when you make a mistake. They understand when you fall down. They understand when that addiction that you thought you left and was done with gets back a hold of you and you trip and fall. And you climb back out of the hole all over again. The world is like, hey, I'm sorry for your loss. We're right here behind you pushing. You just go to any AA meeting. The guys, they fall off the wagon, and everybody's there to try and help them and try and get them back to where they're no longer drinking again. The world understands it when we fall. The world understands it when a husband cheats on his wife or a wife cheats on her husband. The world understands it when a brother hits a brother. The world understands a whole lot of sin. They understand our sin because they've got sin. They understand it to a limited degree. They understand when we mess up. They understand. I mean, one of the things about me is I don't even pretend to be perfect because I fail every day. I don't even try. I just try and be better than I was yesterday, you know. They understand, the world understands that. I can witness to people because I've been divorced. I can witness to people that other people can't witness to. I can witness to people because at one time I was a drug user. I can witness to people because I had problems. Then the world understands that. The world understands hating an enemy. They hate their enemies. If you don't always love your enemies the way you should, the world will be a little forgiving of that to a degree, won't they? The world understands even family estrangement. You know, if your folks don't talk to you, you don't talk to your folks, you have problems with your kids, maybe your brother, your sister won't talk to you, they understand that. The world's got those problems too. What the world does not understand is believers hating believers. They will not forgive that. They will not look over that. They will not say, oh, this person's got faith, when you hate other people who have faith. There's a saying, you've probably heard of it. You know, like I say it about my boys all the time. I'm like, sometimes they're as thick as thieves. They hang out, they just love on it. They just almost one unit, you know. You know, thieves are thick. Thieves understand what it is to love another thief. Certainly we, as believers, should understand what it is to love other people who believe, even if they don't always agree with everything we agree with. The world doesn't understand when two people who say they follow the same Elohim, they say they're saved by the same Messiah, they say that they're under the same blood that was shed on the same cross. The world doesn't understand how those two people can hate each other. It reminds me of this story I heard about this guy that was going to commit suicide. This guy, he was standing on a bridge and he was just, you know, he's like, nobody loves me. And this other guy walks by and sees him. And he says, what are you doing? He goes, I'm going to jump off this here bridge. I'm done. And he says, no, man, don't do that. Don't do that. And he says, well, why not? And he says, well, certainly you got some reason to live. And he goes, no, I don't have anything. He says, well, don't you go to church anywhere? Don't you have faith? The guy says, oh, yeah, I go down to First Baptist Church on the corner of, you know, Meadowlark and Fifth Avenue or something. I don't know. And the guy's like, I go to church there. The guy says, yeah? And he says, yeah, I go to that church every Sunday. He goes, where do you sit? And he goes, oh, I sit close to the back. And he goes, well, I'm a front row guy. But, you know, that's cool. We both go to the same church. And he says, yeah. And he goes, well, you go to the First Baptist Church. Well, what kind of Bible do you use? He says, I use the King James. He goes, well, that's the Bible I use. And he's like, man, I didn't think I had anything in common with anybody. So I was like, yeah, man, you trust me, there's a lot more. We've got a lot of stuff in common. And he's like, really? And he says, yeah. And he goes, well, I'm divorced. The guy says, I'm divorced too. He's like, wow, you know what I'm going through. You can feel my pain. He says, yeah. And the guy on the bridge says, well, but I really don't think you get me. And he goes, well, why not? And he goes, because I eat clean. And the Baptist pushed him off the bridge. It's funny, but it's true. Isn't that what we do? Don't we push somebody off the bridge because there's a minute aspect of their faith that's a little bit different than ours? That's not how we ought to live. That's not how we ought to be. We need to take something from the thieves and be a little bit thicker, don't we? We need to be a little bit closer to one another. We need to love one another enough, not just to say, hey, I'm going to tell you the truth about the way that dress looks on you, but love somebody enough to keep your mouth shut sometimes too. Right? We need to love somebody enough to accept the fact that they're not going to believe everything you believe. I got a little secret for you. You look to your left. That person does not believe everything you believe. Yeah, I know it's shocking, and yet we get along okay. Same thing's true if anybody's sitting on your right. You don't always have to agree on everything. Well, I had a friend who went to the last church that I pastored, and she used to say all the time, and I really liked it. She goes, we're adults. We don't always have to agree. It's okay to have different opinions and different beliefs. The thing is that we demonstrate our faith by not allowing those little things to overcome this love that we ought to have for one another and for other believers outside these walls. So when Paul says, after I had heard of your faith in Master Yahushua and love unto all the saints, I pray for you. Think about that. He heard their faith. There's a whole world of saved people and lost people that are watching you. They're watching you because you keep the Sabbath and they don't. Or they're watching you because you keep the feasts and they don't. Or they're watching you because you've had victory over some sin that they haven't had victory over. And they're watching you. And maybe the sin that you've had victory over, they don't even count it as wrong. And the question that we have to ask ourselves, the question that you have to ask yourself and that I have to ask myself is, how loud is your faith? Is your faith going to be loud enough that the Pauls of this world are going to, their ears are going to perk up and they're going to say, hey, something's going on over here at 16 Mile Sabbath Keepers. Something's going on over here in the Evans household. Something's going on over here in the Garcia household. I can't help but believe that all of those people on the back row there are to some degree affected or a result of somebody hearing Buck and Carrie's faith. How loud is your faith? Has your life been changed by your own faith? I mean, we expect our faith to reach out and change other people's lives, to affect them to a place where they come to repentance. Has your faith affected your life? Has your life changed? Is it a different life than the life of any other person in the world, any lost person? Faith should look significantly different than worldliness. Shouldn't look the same at all. I mean, just like the color red is significantly different than the color white. Significantly different. Faith should look significantly different. It should look different, not just to you, but to everybody around you. It should look different than their life. When your faith is being lived, when you have a loud faith, it should wake people up. People should they should come awake. And you know what? You're going to meet people that have loud faith that's different than yours, and it should wake you up. If nothing else, it should make you a little mad. You know, the first time somebody told me I need to keep the Sabbath, I kind of got a little mad. But now I'm here killing it. I'm joking. The deal is that your faith ought to be waking people up. You should be getting a response. You know, how loud is your faith? Let's all stand.